Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of City Spotlight. I'm your host Pablo Pereira. Today we're talking books, but not just any books. We're talking rare books, one-of-a-kind books, and some books that date back 400 or 500 years old. We're at David Brass's Rare Books here in Calabasas, standing in front of what's known as a gentleman's library. Well, here's a bit of book trivia for you. Did you know that the oldest printed book dates back to the year 1455? It's the Gutenberg Bible. And if you had just one leaf, one page of that book, it could be worth anywhere from $75,000 to $100,000. Well, how do we know that? Well, we talked to the expert, David Brass, for this edition of City Spotlight. Well, we've made it inside this complex of rare books, and I can tell you this, if you're looking for Barnes & Noble in Calabasas, it's easy to find. This place, not so easy, but we can promise you it's right here in Calabasas city limits. David Brass is the owner of David Brass Rare Books.
That's right.
Welcome, and it's
Thank
your
you.
65th birthday.
My 65th birthday today.
Are you happy about that? A little depressed?
I feel very young. I look young.
Yeah, you do.
It's good.
That's the good part. Let's talk a little bit about your business, but before we do that, your business is all about rare books,
Rare
right?
books.
I have brought in what I consider the Pereira family's rarest book, and you said that Stephen is kind of an expert on this.
Yeah, he's an expert researcher.
So if I give Stephen this book by the time we're done with our interview, hopefully Stephen will have...
He'll give you a story.
He'll give me a story. Good. Stephen, here you go.
Okay.
And have fun, and we'll talk to you in a little bit.
This is the rare book room. It's my office. This is where I keep all of our rare books. And we have a big selection of American, English, continental literature, children's books, fine bindings, color plate books, private press books, generally high spots of collecting.
All right, let's go back in time a little bit. You're not new to this business, obviously, other than the fact it's your birthday, and we've already embarrassed you with your age. You've been doing this for a while. Your family's been doing this for a long time. Tell me about that.
Well, actually, my great-grandfather started our business in 1876 in Holywell Street, Strand. His name was Emmanuel Joseph. And then they moved the business to Charing Cross Road, a very famous location for bookshops in London. They moved there in 1901. Also, in our family was another bookshop, 84 Charing Cross Road, which was Marks & Co. And they wrote that was a series of correspondence between a New York journalist, Helen Hanff, and the manager of this bookshop, and became a best-selling book, and then a movie, and a play on Broadway and in London, and the only thing they've got left to do is put it on ice at Wembley.
And that movie was?
84 Charing Cross Road.
So that's really kind of a story about your family.
It's about our family, that's right. It's all one family.
Why do you think they made a movie about it? What do you think so interesting about the whole family history in the book business?
The movie actually was about this correspondence between the bookshop manager and this journalist, Helen Hanff. And it was at a time just after the war when there was rationing in London, when it's very difficult to get things. And they were corresponding with each other, and as bookseller and client, they then became great friends, although they never met each other. That's the strange thing. And she would send him parcels of food, and he'd write back, and it became very, very personal. And that's why they decided to make the movie. And the movie was with Anne Bancroft and Anthony Hopkins, and it was a huge success, very, very, very successul indeed.
So why books? Why did your family go into books? Was that something people did back in the 1800s, or what?
Well, I'll tell you, my great-grandfather was in partnership with another man who they had a general store together, and this is before 1876. And one day, the other guy turned around to my grandfather and said, "You know what? I want to start selling food and other things." And my great-grandfather said, "No, I don't want to do that. I just want to be in the book business." So he left, and the other guy formed Harrods, which was maybe he made the wrong decision, but there you are. But our family business, actually, although my great-grandfather started in 1876, actually there is a legend, maybe true.
This is a family legend.
Family legend, that there was a bookseller in St Paul's churchyard in 1516, selling books from a barrow. Must have had great books, right? And apparently, anyway, he was accused of hitting a man over the head with a stone, and he was executed, strung up at Tyburn, the gallows at Marble Arch. So I come from a long line of booksellers, and maybe there's a murderer at the back there somewhere.
So was that a fictional or a non-fiction
We haven't
story?
been able to prove it. It's always told me by my great uncle Sam. And Jack and Sam Joseph were the two sons of Emmanuel Joseph, and they're the ones that I joined them in their business.
So you'd have to think of a family of book collectors, book readers, that there's a lot of interesting stories that go around in the family.
That's right. People say that I wasn't born, I was published.
Interesting. Yeah, that could be a problem. Right?
Yeah.
Especially if you're in what, the 7th edition now, or the 65th
I think
edition?
The 9th.
Okay. So I'm curious, when you were growing up, I mean, was this, you hear so often people have their calling. I mean, did you know this was your calling, or what did you want to do growing up? I'm imagining this may not have been it.
I wanted to be a rock and roll musician, and I was, but that's another story. But at the age of 21, maybe a little bit before that, the family sort of nagged me and said, you've got to start doing something real with your life rather than going out in a rock and roll band. And so, I want you to go into the family business, which I did, and I hated it. I hated it until my grandfather once sent me off to Paris. And I went to Paris for the first time, and I went to this bookshop where I have a look round, and I found this book, and I thought, yeah, that's really a great copy of this book, and it was quite expensive at the time. I think it was like £500. And I thought, but I've never seen a copy looking as nice as that. Yeah, and I said to the guy, okay, I'm from my grandfather, and we'll buy the book, send it to us. And I went back home, and my grandfather said, did you find anything? And I said, well, yeah, I went to this bookshop and I found this book. And he said, what is it? I told him it's Ackerman's Microcosm. He said, what'd you pay for it? And I said, well, about £500. And he raised his hand up as if to hit me, because he said, that's a ridiculously high price. I said, but it's an amazing copy. Anyway, the book arrived, and they both agreed, grandfather and uncle agreed, that it was wonderful. And I sold it the same day for £800, £850. And that was the beginning, that was the cornerstone, that was the turning point for me. I thought, this is a good game, I like this.
But was it, in your mind at 21, was it making money, or was there a passion for the whole hunt and the search?
It was that's when when I went to Paris and found that book. That's what enlightened me, and that's what started my thrill of the chase, and that's what it's been ever since. The thrill of the chase. And
you haven't lost that, I take it?
No.
So you opened this place when?
Opened this place in 8 years ago.
And why here?
We live here.
Okay, good idea.
We live in Calabasas. I was when we moved to the States in '93 from London, and I was the vice president of Heritage Bookshop in Los Angeles, and I was there until '94, and then we started up on our own here. I didn't want the commute anymore. I didn't want to drive down to Beverly Hills every day, and it's a mile from my house to here. If I get stuck on all the lights, it takes me 3 minutes. It's a better life. So
your experience, I mean, you're not just a Calabasas bookseller. You're pretty well known around the world, aren't you?
Yes. I was the president of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association in Great Britain, and I'm a member of ILAB, which is the International League of Antiquarian Booksellers. We've attended shows and conferences all over the world. I go to Japan every year. I've been there 34 times. Do a lot of business with the Japanese. A lot of business in Europe. We've been to Australia. We've been to South Africa, buying books, selling books. Our customers are worldwide.
You're English. You look at other books from other languages.
Absolutely,
does that make it more? Does that create any issues for you if you're looking at books of Arabic language or Latin or whatever it might be?
I generally go for the authors that I know. I have a very wide knowledge of the great books in sort of most fields, and that's what you need to be a bookseller. You need great knowledge to be able to recognise things, and you need taste. and flair to pick something up and say, I've never seen this before, but it looks interesting. And then that's when I might buy it, and then I'll give it to Steve to catalogue.
So you're a mile or two from your home.
Right.
You're here, but why here? Why not have an open bookshop people can come into?
I don't want an open bookshop. No, we do. Our business is really entirely done on the telephone and our online presence and our catalogues that we put out. Very few people, unfortunately, come and see us here. We'd like to see more, but we want to see, collectors. You couldn't have an open bookshop with this type of material. You just couldn't do it.
Speaking of this material, you brought me into your office.
Yes.
And this office is special. This is the room of rare books.
The sanctum.
It is. Okay. So you're going to show me a couple of things there.
Let's start with A.
Okay.
Right? Okay. So here we've got, this is Jane Austen.
Okay.
Right? This is the first edition of Pride and Prejudice. This is just a case that's enclosing the original books. This is the first edition of Pride and Prejudice, published in 1813. And it's in its original binding. It's 3 volumes, and it's quite spectacular. This was Austen's second novel, but it's the most famous one, and it's the most valuable, and it's the most wanted. And to find it in original state like this is very, very rare. A lot of things about these books, for instance, this is called a half title. And most copies you'll find of this book don't have the half title. And some of the copies even have facsimile half titles. So the amount of work that Steve has to do and I have to do, we have to check every single leaf of these books and make sure that they're all original, because they were doing facsimiles of these things 100 years ago. They were valuable then,
right?
Let alone now. And this is an amazing copy. As I say, got the 3 volumes here. And it really is quite spectacular.
So where did you find that? Can you share that with us?
I bought that in London from a colleague who'd bought it from another colleague who'd bought it from a private collection.
So this is not for sale. This is your own.
Oh, it's for sale.
Oh, it is?
Absolutely.
So no book you have is not for sale?
Correct.
So anybody can make an offer on any book?
Well, they're all priced.
Right.
The books are priced. I've actually always believed that booksellers shouldn't be book collectors, because otherwise you're in competition with your clients. I know a lot of booksellers who made that mistake and who formed their own collection, and when they were buying things they said, I'll take that and I'll put that with my collection. And that's the last thing your clients want to hear.
So how many copies of this in this condition are there today?
Probably less than 10 in the world in that condition.
And you know that because you know some of the other
We know where
people?
the copies are, yes. Yeah.
And how many were originally produced? Do we know that?
I think 500.
500.
Yeah.
And then it was reissued and
reissued and reissued. Yeah, I mean, it's a best-selling book.
And you've had this for how long?
A year.
And can you share what something like this would cost?
It's $75,000.
$75,000.
Yes.
So it's for sale.
It's for sale, $75,000, including the case.
Including the case. And how do you come to that number?
Actually, how do I come? It's very reasonably priced at $75,000. A copy in the original boards. Books came out in those days in boards like this, and this was a temporary binding. And so what you do is you take this along to your local bookbinder, because this wasn't supposed to last. You'll take along your local bookbinder and he will put it in a binding like that at the time in 1813. Okay? Now, there was a copy that came up and it made $250,000 in the original boards. This is the next best thing to original boards, which is, so we priced it at $75,000. I've seen copies of this book for $110,000.
So, I mean, is the point for someone to get this, to hold on to it, to make money on it, or do you find more of your clientele to be people who just really love books and are going to sit down and open this up and actually sit and physically read it?
People aren't going to sit and physically read this. This is a collectible. I mean, if somebody wants to read this, we'll give them a copy, a reading copy to go with it. This is a collectible. This is historically a tremendously important book. Right? This book is nearly 200 years old, and it's survived, and it's in its original state. It was a best-selling book at the time. So the books that tend to survive tend to be the ones that people weren't interested in and didn't want and didn't read. But the ones that were successful in the first place were literally read to pieces. And therefore, and the reason they put it in 3 volumes, by the way, is that there was no television, there was no radio. So reading was the main form of entertainment. And if they made a too thick a book, people couldn't put it in their pockets. So they made them in 3 books, so as you could take one with you, put it in your pocket, read it, go home, get the second one, and so on. Which, of course, destroyed a lot of copies because people just lost. They'd lose volume 2 or they'd lose volume 3. You know, it wasn't all in one. But that was the idea of being in multi-volume. This is the first edition of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. This is published.
Wow,
this is published in 1901. It's a spectacular copy. It's the finest copy of the book I've ever seen. It's this original cloth, totally untouched, absolutely amazing. Now, what's interesting about this one, we've been trying to prove this. It says here, "To my dear Livain, with a Merry Christmas greeting from Aunt Maud." Now, Maud was Baum's wife, but we have not, and it's dated 1901, we've not been able to prove that this is her handwriting. We can't find any specimens of Baum's wife's handwriting. And there was a nephew called Livain. That would make it, if we could prove this, it would make it worth a lot more money. But believe me, we've tried.
So are books with authors' signatures worth more than without?
Absolutely. Books with author signatures are worth more. But also, books with, you're just talking about a signature. This is a presentation.
Right,
when you get a presentation, the recipient counts as well. So, for instance, we recently had a copy of a first edition of Charles Dickens, which was inscribed by Dickens to Hans Andersen. And that's great. And then we found out the story about it, and it was an amazing thing. It was one of 12 books that Dickens inscribed to Hans Andersen in London in the 1840s.
So you would suggest that when authors in this day and age hold book signings, it's a good idea to go and get your book signed?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. I mean, for instance, because you never know. If we're going to go on to modern books, for instance, the real first edition of the Harry Potter book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, that's now a $20,000 to $30,000 book.
You don't have that here?
I don't have one. No. I don't really deal too much in modern firsts.
I gotcha.
Okay, I'm much more an antiquarian bookseller.
Okay.
But let's go back let's go back a little bit. Let's go back, for instance, to 1953. You know, with Ian Fleming and James Bond.
Absolutely.
Right. So Ian Fleming went to Jonathan Cape, the publishers. He said, "I've written this book," and so the guy says, "You know, well, what's it about?" He said, "It's about this guy called James Bond." He said, "I don't know," and well, go on, please publish it. Okay, we'll do 500 copies. Of course, it was a smash success. So the next book came back. They did 500 copies again, a little bit cautious. The next book, 1,000. The next book, 10,000. The next book, 100,000, and so on. So, for instance, as far as the James Bond books are concerned, the first one, Casino Royale, is a $20,000 book, whereas Octopussy, which is one of the last ones, is a $100 book.
Which had the best name of all the movies, right?
I know.
It did.
And it's a $100 book.
Okay, we're joined by Steve Gertz now, and he is the executive director, self-appointed title, right?
Well, we needed a title that would impress our wealthy clients.
I gotcha.
As opposed to the schlepper for David.
Okay, so what do you do here again? I mean, David introduced you before. Tell me exactly what you do.
Well, aside from selling books, when we buy books, it's up to me to figure out just exactly what the book is, research its history, find out as much as I can about that particular copy, because sometimes a copy will have a book plate. The book may have belonged to somebody famous, or there could be an inscription that belonged to somebody famous, and that famous person may have known the author, which makes it even more interesting. Or the book may be a complete blank. We don't know what the heck it is, and it's up to me to figure out what we have here. And write a story that will make it compelling for a collector.
So what makes a good book to collect?
Well, there are so many factors, Pablo. It's hard to begin. But basically, collectors like to have a book in its earliest possible published appearance. So you not only want the first edition, but the first printing. And sometimes a first printing will have different issues, some coming out prior to others. So ideally, you'd want the first edition, first printing, first issue. Collectors love it when the book is signed by the author. They love it when it's belonged to somebody who was associated with the author, or someone that didn't know the author at all, but who is someone of note in and of themselves. So that's the kind of thing that collectors look for. And they also want to know, for instance, the provenance of the book, where it came from, the chain. Some books we've had pass through our hands have been around for 300 years. So it's always interesting to know who the owners have been over the last few hundred years.
So, I'm sorry, when you get a new book in, then how long does it take you to tell that story that you just talked about?
Oh, you mean a new old book?
Correct. Thank you. I've learned something new today. Very good.
What was the question again?
When you get a new old book
Yeah.
in, how long does it take you to tell the story that you associate with that book?
It depends on how much has already been written about the book. There's a whole branch of scholarship, bibliography, that does nothing but examine all the books that a particular author has published, all the details, the publication details, everything that was known at the time of the book's publication, and some things that were learned subsequent to that. So if that information is available, that makes my job a lot easier. But sometimes there are books that haven't had any reasonable scholarship beyond just the bare bones. And then it's up to me to look hither and yon to find whatever I can about the book, the author, and so on.
Is that fun for you, that part?
I love it. I love it. Now, this process could take anywhere from a half hour to, on a particularly hard book, it could take 5-6 hours. I worked on a book yesterday that basically took me 3 days, not 3 solid days, but 3 days to put together the information I needed to write a note that A, made sense, and B, made a great case for this book to be bought by a collector.
What was the book?
Well, it was a very obscure book containing type specimens that was published somewhere between 1636 and 1650.
Type specimens.
Type specimens, the fonts, the letters, the look of the letters, each...
Right. Kids today don't know what type specimens are.
Of course,
so,
forgive me. Yeah,
It's
but
okay. It's all right.
Like New York Times Roman or Helvetica,
Thank you.
that kind of stuff.
That's very interesting, though. To you, that's very interesting.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. As I was saying earlier, if every book tells a story, every book has a story. And so it's up to me to tell the story of the book.
And how did you get into this?
I've been a book lover since I was a child. I had no social life as a kid. My parents had to push me into Boy Scouts and all that kind of stuff. My idea of a good time was to sit in my room and read.
So, just for fun, we gave you a little homework assignment while we went in the other room. And initially, I came back and asked you about the book I presented you at the top of the show. And you did say it threw you for a loop. But you're already prepared to tell me what it is now, or not?
I'm prepared to tell you as much as I can tell you at this point. Shall I begin?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Please do.
Well, anytime you want to catalog a book, the first thing you want to do is physically inspect it. What are you looking at? So first thing I see on the cover is that this is a picture that somebody cut out and pasted on the front of the book, and the title appears to be hand-lettered, and that's a separate strip from this picture. This picture looks very much like what you'd expect something by Kate Greenaway to look like, a very famous British illustrator. So we know this is not a Kate Greenaway book because it's Mima in Rhineland by Don Hartman. And we have a date here, February 26, 1934. Significantly, this is not set in type. It's all hand done, as is every page in the book. The illustrations that are in the book have also been cut out from another source and pasted in. It's a lovely, charming little story. It's long for what you'd expect a children's book to be. but it's actually a little delight. So what we have here is a one-off. This was something very special that I'm presuming Don Hartman, the father, did for perhaps his daughter Mima. We have purple ink, green ink. This is all hand
You
done.
can hold it up, show it to
Yeah.
the camera.
It's all hand done in purple ink. There were green highlights, as you see here. There are illustrations, for instance, here that have been cut out with a caption in yet another color ink. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Now, let me also say here that we have a publisher's stamp on the back of this book, but this book was never published.
Right.
After I did the physical inspection, I went online through a book search source that we have to see if there were any books out there called Mima in Rhineland by Don Hartman. There aren't.
Okay.
But just because there's not one being offered today doesn't mean that one wasn't published in the past. My next step was to go to something called the OCLC, which is a catalog of all major libraries in the world and their holdings. So I checked to see if there was any library in the world that had a copy of Mima in Rhineland by Don Hartman. There is not. There does not seem to be a trace of this book, which only reinforces my suspicion that this is a one-off. It was never published. This was a very special something that Don Hartman did for a daughter or a niece, perhaps. Now, I'm presuming that, as you said, that this is a family copy and that either Don Hartman or Mima is somewhere in your family. Yeah?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to also presume that the family has lived at some point in Southern California.
That's true.
Okay. Now I'm going to take a cognitive leap, which you will
Okay.
confirm, that Don Hartman is the same Don Hartman that worked as a screenwriter in Hollywood, a producer, director, worked on some Hope and Crosby movies, a Cary Grant movie, was quite active, was also a songwriter too. Did a song called Ring Something Rhyme, in any case. So
Correct.
you put together little pieces of circumstantial evidence and you can build a pretty strong case for this being written by the Don Hartman, who was a producer, director, screenwriter, also had a production at Paramount, I think, in
Correct.
the early 50s. You've just confirmed it by
Oh,
saying
yes,
yes.
absolutely.
Okay, so that's my 15-minute study of this little book. Very charming. Obviously, a lot of wear here. We've lost the spine.
I've done the tape work, unfortunately, yeah.
Well, I figure this book was probably, it wasn't read so much as physically adored, which is why it's in such a state of distress. Mima obviously loved this book and read it to bits.
All right, so we've got the history, Dan. You've done good work on that. But you know what I really want to know is it worth anything? It's a first edition, right?
Well,
It's a first copy. It's signed by the author. It's personalized to the person that it was. I mean, it's met all these criterias that you've talked about. I have to figure it's worth something.
well, I'm going to channel a friend of mine who works on Antiques Roadshow for diplomacy.
Oh, no, I know where this is going now.
Because this is a book whose value cannot be calculated in terms of sentiment.
Got it.
But in terms of market value for a collector, it has little value at all,
I got it.
okay? But to the family, it's priceless.
And I wouldn't sell it either. So
No,
there you go.
no, I don't think you should. Priceless to the family, but to a collector, even someone who collects children's books, not a great deal of value, if any at all.
Okay. Fair
But a
enough.
great book, great little thing, great little story.
Okay, awesome.
Thanks for letting me look at it.
Thank you very much. I
Okay.
appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Nice
Thank
job.
you.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
All right, we're back with David Brass now. This is just fascinating. I can't get enough of this. This is better than any library I've been into, so we appreciate your time. You've brought out some other special books that you have a close affection for, if you will, and maybe your oldest book right here. Why don't you tell me about that?
This is the oldest one we have at the moment. This is published. This is Geoffrey Chaucer, the works of Geoffrey Chaucer, the guy that wrote the Canterbury Tales, and this is published in 1561. Now, the first editions of Chaucer were published actually in the 15th century, in the late 1400s, but they are literally priceless. I mean, you're talking millions of dollars for one of those. This really is the last obtainable, the earliest obtainable edition of Chaucer. As 1561, there were 2 issues of this book. One which didn't have any illustrations. This one, which has got these 24 woodcuts at the front. Very, very, very rare. Very rare indeed. These woodcuts were taken from one of the earlier editions from the beginning of the 16th century. This book actually was owned by a doctor in London. I used to know this man in the 60s. He was a friend of my grandfather's. And when he died, his books were sold by another bookseller in London, a guy called Bill Fletcher, who did take the nicest books home for himself. And Bill took this one home. And Bill died a few years ago, and Bill's son sold this one to me. So this is the first, we've got it. It's come out of, it's been in a collection for so many years, and now it's on the market again. Very, very wonderful book, very rare. The condition is quite amazing. The book, this is not the original binding. The book was rebound for the doctor. There's his book plate there. And he probably had that bound around 1950, 55, something like that.
That's all. Can we open this up for a second again? This, no, at the very beginning here, this is what Stephen does, right?
This is what Stephen does.
This is
exactly.
the story.
This
is what he calls the story of the story of the book.
Right. The story of the story.
And so this is pretty important.
It's very important because we need to educate our clients. A lot of our clients already know, but we're interested in the people that don't know. And book collecting should be fun. So it's a learning process, and we explain to people the importance of the book and why it's priced what it is and just how rare it is. We tell them how many copies there are in libraries worldwide and so on, and the last time that the copy appeared at auction, and everything that we can possibly do about the book. So we want the purchaser, the collector, to become very, very well informed. And in becoming well informed, he then becomes more hungry to
Let's go through some of these other things you just pulled off the shelf fairly quickly, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Some of these things that you
show you
enjoy.
this. We talked earlier about original boards. This is from 1790. This is the original binding. So when this came out, people would take this to the local bookbinder and have it put in a calf binding. But this is very interesting. This book here, this is the first edition of Captain Bligh, the narrative of the mutiny on the Bounty.
Oh, I like that.
Right?
Yeah.
So off he went, sailed along, and all the people kicked him off the boat. And when he came back, he wrote this account of what had happened to him. So it says, a narrative of the mutiny on board His Majesty's ship Bounty, written by Lieutenant William Bligh, illustrated with charts, London, and that's 1790. And you see it's got these original charts in it showing the Bounty's launch. They took them off the Bounty and put them on a launch and cast them out to sea, and that's what he was cast out to sea on. And then there are maps here showing where he went.
Wow.
Right? And this is what we call original boards uncut. You see the pages are uncut. When you took it to a binder, he would then trim it like that. That's quite an amazing copy, and I like to keep old booksellers' labels. This was in here, and this is from Charles Sessler. Now this is a bookshop that was in the 50s. And here they are describing it somewhere around 1940, 1950, and saying there, very rare, few copies exist in original condition.
And how much would a book like this be worth?
It's $25,000.
$25,000. Okay.
Very hard to find them in the original state. Now, of course, it's been protected by this box. The box was probably made at the turn of the 20th century. But that's what's protected it.
Awesome.
Okay? I like books in boxes. We like boxes.
Okay. Feel free to grab a couple of more.
Now I'll show you, this is the first edition of Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. I put this cover on it to protect it. We'll take that off for the moment. There we are. That's the first edition of Alice in Wonderland. This is published in New York in 1866. Now, actually, the real first edition of Alice was published in London in 1865. But what happened was they sent out a couple of hundred sample copies. The illustrator, Tenniel, didn't like the way the illustrations looked, and so he took an injunction out against the publisher, and the 200 copies were recalled. they recalled 182. There are 18 copies still out there with the 1865 title page. The last one sold for $2 million.
So this is kind of like when the U.S. Mint messes up a coin,
Correct.
and then they pull them back.
That's right.
And the coin that becomes valuable
Correct.
is the messed up mint coin, right?
Correct.
This is the same type of thing.
Same thing.
Interesting.
So, and they pulped 180 copies, but then they still had 1,800 copies left because they were printing 2,000. And so they sent the 1,800 sheets to New York because they didn't want to lose the money that they'd invested in. They had it published actually by a different publisher. Just the title page was changed. So this is the first edition. Let's call it second state.
Understood.
As Stephen
Understood.
was talking about.
Okay, what else do we have here?
Okay. Now we've got here, oh dear, a copy of Huckleberry Finn. This is the first edition of Huckleberry Finn. This is published in 1885. This is in the original cloth. It's absolutely as new.
That book looks like you just
Isn't
bought it across the street.
Isn't it amazing?
doesn't it?
And you
Yeah.
see this, this has caused a little stain here, but that really doesn't matter. The joints here are absolutely fine. I mean, this is an amazing book. And with this book, there were issue points. This one is not the very first issue, but it's an early issue. There are some things here. There are some on page 57, for instance. It says here, I took the bagweight and ripped a hole in the bottom of it with the saw. Now, that's the correct. But the very, very first one said with the was.
Ah, so it's
They made a
misspelled.
mistake.
Uh-huh.
Right, the very, very first ones. If this had a with the was in it, it would be worth twice as much as it is. This is $9,500 because of its spectacular condition.
Right.
We're talking weeks apart from the two.
Right.
That's all.
But if the one word mistake had been left
there
in,
are three. There are
there's
three
three
actually. There's
mistakes.
three mistakes. Yeah, there are actually three, and you have three or none.
So do you look for that, or do you let Stephen
I
do
do.
that?
I look at that when I buy. That's all in my head. When I buy the books, I look for that.
Okay.
It's Steve that puts it out into understandable description.
Give me one more. Show me one more. I mean, we could go all day with this, but give me one
Well,
more.
we're
that
going to
you
go
like.
an American book.
Thank you.
Okay. And here we've got, this is the first edition of Moby Dick. Right. The great Captain Ahab. What's spectacular about this copy, this book was published in 1851. And
In New York.
it was published in New York, but actually the first edition was published in London in the same year in 3 volumes. We talked about the 3 volumes. That's actually a rarer book. That comes in blue cloth, and a first edition of that in the blue cloth would be probably $250,000 now, in fine condition. It was then published in New York, and it came out in various different colours. Usually they're sort of slate grey or blue. Red is the rarest colour. Now, I've not had this restored because, again, we don't want... Years ago, everybody would have just had that restored. They'd have that tidied up. We don't touch them anymore. This is actually in the original state. It's completely untouched here. It's absolutely... It's the finest copy of this book that I've seen. There it is, Moby Dick or The Whale by Herman Melville. Now, the first edition in London was just called The Whale. Okay? And this is an amazing copy.
Why did they change the name from the first edition to the New York edition?
That's a good question. I've never thought about it.
We'll have to get Stephen on
We'll have to
that.
get Stephen asking, exactly.
I've actually come up with a question David doesn't know the answer
Yeah.
to.
No, I don't know. I don't know why they only called it The Whale. That's strange, yeah.
Let's leave this stuff out here and talk for a minute. What do you think someone at home might do who has shelves of books at home? Is it worth their time and effort to look? What types of things should someone look for to decide if they have a book that might be a collector's book or actually worth something?
Oh, so in other words, we're talking about books they already have.
Yeah,
Okay.
people at home. How would someone, myself or someone, decide, I have these books here, I
They
wonder...
can call me.
Okay.
They can call. I answer the telephone all day long. I have people have been inquiring. Our website gives us tremendous presence, and so people tend to look up on the web and they see what they can find, and then if they're looking for something, any of these books that I have, my name's going to come up, and they're going to ring me and say, what's my copy worth, and so we do that. But I would say, generally, Books need to be in their original bindings. If they're modern first editions, like we were talking about James Bond earlier, okay, or even Harry Potter, the Harry Potter books, they've got to be in their original dust jackets. That's very, very important. Believe it or not, but the jacket on many of those books is worth more than the book itself.
Interesting.
Okay, and that's very, so, you know, for instance, as an example, if you had a Casino Royale without a jacket, it's a hard book to sell. But if you've got it with the jacket, you know, it's 20,000 plus.
Okay, so the jacket.
The dust jacket. And the dust jacket, another thing is that very often when people gave books away, they'd cut the price out. The price would be on the corner of the jacket on the inside flap. And especially they gave it as a gift, they'd trim it off. That actually devalues the book quite a lot too. You want everything in the original state as it left the publishing house.
Okay, so original state, what else?
Condition. And that really should have come first. Condition is the most important thing. Fine condition is everything. If this book, I mean, this has never been touched, but if this book was totally mint, it would be $100,000.
Mm-hmm.
This has never been touched, but it's got some wear on it. It's $45,000.
So what's the best way to store a book then? Maybe that's a good question.
Cases. I make a lot. Most of the books we have cases. Many of them have had cases for many years. If I buy books that haven't got cases, I'll make a case for them because this definitely protects them.
All right, I'm going to say 6-letter word. Kindle.
Yes.
What do you think?
I'm disgusted by it.
I just had a feeling that was like the worst 4-letter word someone could say to you.
Yeah.
What's wrong with the Kindle?
I'll tell you what's wrong with the Kindle. In 300 years' time, the Kindle won't be around. But that'll still be around, the Chaucer, with a bit of luck. It's survived so far. And, you know, as technology changes and a new product comes onto the market, we have difficulty in using the old electronic data in the new machines. And that's just going to get worse. So a Kindle in 300 years' time isn't going to exist. But the Chaucer will be here.
David, thanks so much. You've been a great interview, and this has been a lot of fun. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of City Spotlight. We hope you've been just as fascinated as I have been with this great story about rare books and how lucky we are to have many of these rare books right here in Calabasas at David Brass's Rare Bookstore. If you'd like more information on this story, you can always log on to our website at cityofcalabasas.com. From the Gentleman's Library right here in Calabasas, I'm Pablo Pereira. Thanks so much for joining us.